Hello everybody, welcome back for week 4. We are in a new module now. Now we are turning to look at interpreting science and progress in the museum, which more simply defined is for us to look at some examples of how science is displayed in the museum and moving forward from getting our general background information about this topic. So this is a 2-week module. And so the first is we're going to look at a couple different examples and talk generally about methods of display. The next time you look at the week 5 lecture, and the week 5 materials will be about a particular really well-known controversy in the science museum world and in the world of public history. So I will give you some stuff to think about for next week also at the end of this lecture here, and I will also talk to you about the bibliography. So methods of display. In the readings that you're going to look at for this week, which is the Arnold and McDonald readings, there's going to be a few different examples. Arnold's going to track change over time in terms of how museum displays for science museums in particular operate in science centers. And then McDonald is going to look at one particular exhibit and analyze its approach. Both of these examples are taking place in Europe, but their relevance is still pretty great for us here in the United States. And it's just typically a lot of the museum studies research that's been done on science centers is Europe focused and England focused. So that's the reason why those are the examples we're looking at. When we look at the controversy for next week, it's definitely going to be an American museum, an institution that all of us know, the science-based institution, which is the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., from the Smithsonian. So in these examples, we are looking at, in Arnold, some change over the time where he's starting off by talking about 19th century museums. And I know we've talked about this a little bit already in the weeks leading up to this, but there are some additional things that I want to add on here to make sure that we're understanding why we have the shifts that we have coming into play in our more current iteration of a science museum. So when we're looking at 19th century museums, there are some general sort of characteristics of why the museum emerged in the way that it did during the 19th century. If you remember, we were talking about ideas of progress through civilized versus savagery. We also were looking at imperialism and ideas of progress. All of those things get tied into museum atmospheres in the 19th century. So when we look at the emerging modern museum in the 19th century, they had very specific goals in mind. The first of which, and kind of the overarching intention behind the museum, was twofold, but all tied back to these ideas of a civilized society. So there was the materials that were in the museum, the objects that represented the position of the society that created the institution of the museum. And then it was the ways in which visitors interacted in that space. So overall, if you look at some of the scholarship of this time period, scholars like Tony Bennett and Stephen Kahn talk about how the museum is what's known as a civilizing institution. The objects present a civilized society by the things that have been collected and the ways in which they're arranged. And then the way that the exhibits are laid out basically tell visitors how to act. And so in this time period, which you may remember from Alexander and Alexander, the museum is referred to as a temple. And it's this place where you essentially go to worship or be deferent to the objects that are contained within the institution. At the same time, the visitor is also on display, right? It's a public space. You're visiting, other people are visiting at the same time. We know, if you think about your daily life, everybody people watches, right? You look at what other people are doing, especially in unfamiliar places, to know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. In the museum, cultivated an atmosphere where this sort of environment was highly regulated. So if you can compare a lot of the developments in museums at this time to what was happening in department stores as well, any sort of places where a lot of display is being showcased, these kind of grand styles of display. And similar to department stores, museums were very heavily structured to force people to take a certain route and look at things in a certain way. A good comparison point is if you've ever been to like a store like IKEA, right? It's very, very planned for you to start in one section and kind of weave your way throughout the store. And then at the end, it ensures that you're where all the pallets are for you to buy the things that you found throughout your journey in the store. Museums were very heavily structured in that way. And part of the reason why they were structured was as a controlling feature, right, to make sure people are all moving the same direction and doing the things they're supposed to be doing, but also because the ways in which the objects were displayed were really central to how the narrative was presented in the exhibit. So things that we kind of take for granted in museums today, like a lot of label copy, like something that's describing to you what the objects are about, wasn't really present in the museum at this time. You can kind of tell that from the picture on this slide. It's just the objects themselves. The objects are supposed to speak for themselves in the ways in which they're ordered and the things that are chosen to be there. And the understanding was at the time that if you could put all of the world's knowledge under these glass cases and arrange them in a certain way, they would speak for themselves and you would understand the progress of civilization in the ways in which they were ordered. So it was a very ordered, hierarchical presentation, which aligned with the ideas of civilization and progress and hierarchy that we established in earlier weeks. So this is what's being established at the time. And then as the Arnold article is going to show you, things will change for a variety of reasons. But the big name reason for why things are going to change is because it's at its core a public work, right? Like any sort of public history work, we're operating in different realms than what an academic historian would do, right? You have to constantly be engaging with the public. And when we're talking specifically about history or historical information, we may say, oh, this is all about the past, right? But everything that people are concerned with from the past is connected with the present, right? There's connections to heritage, people's own personal memories or the memories of people that they're close to. You can look at some really hot button issues in recent years, like the Confederate monument controversy in the South, that things in the past are not just about the past. They're always about the present. So that being the case, right, museums always have to respond to public concerns and public desires to stay afloat, right? So of course, methods of display will change over time as audience needs change over time. So we are going to have a shift into the modern display methods that you'll see in these articles. There are a few different reasons outside of just general visitor interests that want more engagement for why this sort of stuff takes place. As the Arnold article will mention, science used to be actually done by professionals in the museum. It used to be a center of practicing scientific work and producing data until we have the elevation of the academic world and the university system. And so professionalization of science in universities moves it out of the museum. So the museum becomes less about producing scientific development and more about presenting things that have been established elsewhere. So that's one of the reasons for why things will change and how things are presented. Also, once we move into the 20th century, there are some major changes socially and economically that force museums to take a different tack. So the first is the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, the rise of new social history, which was a new approach in doing historical work in the academy and outside of it. So instead of focusing just on the great men of an age, we start to look at who were the common people, right? What did they believe? History from the bottom up or from the grassroots becomes much more highly valued and explored, which takes place in the museum by moving it away from this sort of temple-like focus where we all just take museum knowledge at face value and absorb it, to being much more of an interactive process. It becomes much more of a forum-like environment where discussion is encouraged and your own experiences are valued when they're brought to the table in the museum environment. The last two things that really affect display, which you'll see in this quote on the right here, is that there is ever declining federal funding for museums after the early Cold War period, when the United States is at its economic height. And as we have recessions in the 1970s and further periods past this, every time we have some sort of recurrence of stability, funding never really goes back to the levels it had been previously for museums. And so we go through these cycles, right, of losing funding. We don't necessarily get that funding back. And so as declining federal funding happens, there is an increase in private sponsorship of exhibits, which includes, as you'll see in the quote on the right, a variety of different types of peoples or institutions, which we'll see in the Science Museum. One of the major ones is corporate sponsorship. But when funding sources change, the people who have power to dictate what's in the exhibit also changes, right? So that could be in terms of content and the argument that's being made, but it can also be in terms of approach or method of display, right? So if you have corporate sponsorship and they're demanding an interactive exhibit modeled after, say, as you saw in the first chapter of Alexander and Alexander, a Disneyland sort of model, right? Then you have the funding and the resources and the desire from your donor to take that sort of approach. And as you will see, right, and as we know, if you've visited science centers in the past, that's one of the things that makes science centers one of the most popular museum institutions around the world today, is their interactive, almost theme parky style nature, where they blend this educational and entertainment-based approach. So when we're looking at methods of display, the key question that you want to ask yourself when you look at these articles is, what is the museum there for, and what's the relationship between the museum and the exhibits that are within the museum? And I listed here, right, a lot of different approaches that can be taken in science-based museums, right? There can be that leisure-based approach. Everything's based on, a consumer sort of relationship with the visitor, making sure that it's fun, and maybe education is not as highly valued. It can be very specifically that a corporate or government sponsor is trying to promote a product or promote an industry. As you'll see in the example here on the right, General Motors sponsored an exhibit in the 1960s known as the Turning Wheel. They do put out useful, good information about the automobile in this exhibit, but everything is centered on General Motors' accomplishments in the evolution of the automobile, which we would definitively say, right, General Motors was not the only institution to make major developments in the automobile. So there's some issues with that. But if you look at the name of the institution, right, the California Museum of Science and Industry, one of the missions of the institution is to push industries that are tied to Southern California or to the state of California as a whole. So that being the case, right, it is in a direct relationship with the mission of the institution, which makes sense for why an exhibit of this nature would be there. Some other types of methods of display, right, could just be generally about the benefits of science, teaching people why science is good, something to pursue. Cold War era America, right after Sputnik, there was a lot of reason to push students and adults into science-based fields and understanding science. To teach people about the process of scientific study and advancement, which you'll also see the comparison in the Arnold article. And then there are historical reasons for doing even innovative-based exhibits, right, to show the accomplishments that a nation or a region has had in the past, and also to, in some cases, address the problems of the present, which you can also see in this example from the General Motors exhibit, right, that trying to teach people why a seatbelt or why an airbag is important and how it operates is a key part of the work that you may do in an exhibit like this. So ideally, as Arnold is going to say, a good exhibit would address a variety of things. It wouldn't just talk about an innovation, or it wouldn't just talk about how these technologies have been used, but it would be a combination of all of the social and cultural context that created this scientific innovation or this technological development. So you want to ask yourself, because we are at the end of this class coming up with ways to do this successfully, right, is what methods do you think work best to accomplish the goals that you have for your exhibit? So not everybody's answers are going to be the same, right? So when you start thinking about this and you're developing your project, which you may notice in the guide for the final project, is that you're supposed to have a specific museum in which you want your exhibit to be hosted. And so the key way to determine what method works best is to look at those institutions and look at their mission statement. The McDonald article talks about this in a little bit of depth when she lists the Science Museum of London's mission. And it sounds really vague and it sounds really standard, but it says a lot about what the institution is there to do. And we may think that, oh, science centers all kind of do the same thing, and they really don't. Once we start looking into the exhibits and how they're presented, even if all of them have an interactive component or all of them have historical artifacts, does not mean that they're having the same approaches or they have the same end goal in mind. So you want to start to think about what type of institution works best for the sort of exhibit that you want to present. So I said I would tell you to start thinking about how this relationship operates for next week. So I did include a link here to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in their own mission statement. We will look at a very controversial exhibit that actually never came into being because it was so controversial in the early 90s. But it is useful to think about the Air and Space Museum. Why did it come into being? And what were they intending to do with this institution, and the ways in which this exhibit that we'll look at next week does not line up with those things. But it's a good starting point here with the methods that we're looking at when you would use certain types of exhibits with certain types of institutions and how that would work for your own project. So to finish up here, I do want to just talk a little bit about the bibliography. Mainly your sources for the bibliography should be secondary. I want to see your scholarly basis for whatever project you're focused on. So say you're doing the cotton gin, right? You want to have 5 or 6 sources on the cotton gin. If you're having some issue thinking about how to do this, one, make sure they're all peer-reviewed journal articles and books. Some things to think about to help you round out your analysis for doing the content part of your exhibit is obviously look up the innovation or whatever it is that you're focused on itself and see what's been written on that topic. But you also want to look at the broader context of the time period. So if you're looking at, the cotton gin, you want to look at, the rise of the Cotton Kingdom in the South, the antebellum period, what's going on in that time period, and how does that have broader impacts on society. And then also, if you have, say, a company or a governmental entity or a person who created this, or a combination of these things, which tends to happen fairly often, you want to look at maybe broader stories about these people or these institutions that created the thing that you're interested in, and that will also give you some good contextual information. For the part at the bottom, you don't have to have a scholarly list of primary sources, but I have found in the past that it is easier for students to find a collection that already exists. So when you start putting your project together, you kind of already know what's in place at your institution, and you have a lot of different examples of things to draw from to put into your PowerPoint. You don't have to if you already have a really good idea that you feel like you can find a lot of information for. It doesn't have to be in the institution since this is a hypothetical project. But if you want to go the route of looking through collections, go to some really well-known science centers or museums around the country and see if they have their collections online. The National Air and Space Museum does at this link, so that's a good place to start. But if you have any questions about that or you have concerns about primary source stuff, feel free to shoot me an email. That is all that I have for you this week. I will see all of you back here for week 5 when we talk about our controversial museum exhibit.